Okay, so again, just to re-emphasize this point, mental illness and mental health. Mental illness is a health concern, significantly affects how a person thinks, behaves, interacts. So I'll go back to that slide from last week about think, feels, and behaves. Mental illness affects the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we behave. And mental health also affects how a person thinks, feels, and behaves, but to a lesser extent than a mental illness. And in terms of mental health, it can be varied. Mental health, you could be very happy, and things could be going well, and but you could also be feeling down and a little bit sad. You might be feeling not particularly well. Feel like things are getting on top of you, but that's not a mental illness as such. Mental illness is when you are significantly affected by the way you behave, interact, and think. Okay. Okay, so there's some stages of mental health conditions. There's mild symptoms and warning signs in stage 1. A person may show some signs of a mental health condition, still able to maintain the ability to function at home, work, or school, perhaps not as easily as before they started to show symptoms. And there's a sense that something's not right. And you will have experienced this with clients and probably with friends and maybe family members, where people are starting to act a little differently than the way they normally act. They seem to be a little, if you like, out of sorts. They seem to be taking things a little bit harder than they used to. They're reacting more strongly than they used to. They don't seem to be able to cope as well as they did. A whole range of ways that plays out. Stage 2, the symptoms increase in frequency and severity, interfere with life activities and roles. Becomes obvious that something is wrong. The person's symptoms may become stronger and last longer, or new symptoms may start to appearing on top of existing ones, creating something of a snowball effect. Their school or work performance might be more difficult and more affected. They may have trouble keeping up with family duties, social obligations, or personal responsibilities. Again, going back to friends and family as examples, they may stop having contact, they may stop going out, they may stop being the life of the party. They may, there'll be some significant change that you will recognise generally. Things will be different. They will talk differently. They'll have less contact. They may see things much more negatively than they have before, or they might see things much more positive than they have before because they may be in a manic state. Stage 3, symptoms start to worsen with relapsing and recurrent episodes accompanied by serious disruption in life activities and roles. Symptoms having continued increase in severity, and many symptoms are often taking place at the same time. Person feels as though they are losing control of their life and the ability to fill their roles at home, work, or school. So the person starts to feel out of control at this point. They may shut down significantly or totally. They may sabotage contacts. They may lose contacts, but they might also deliberately try and sabotage relationships and contacts. They may not be turning up for work. They may abrogate their responsibilities at home. They may not be doing what they're supposed to be doing as a carer or a sibling. They may be in a totally different headspace to where they've been before. And stage 4, symptoms are persistent and severe and have jeopardized one's life. A combination of extreme, prolonged and persistent symptoms and impairment often results in development of other health conditions and has the potential to turn into a crisis event like unemployment, hospitalisation, homelessness, or even incarceration. In the worst cases, untreated mental illnesses can lead to loss of life, an average of 25 years early. So where things are particularly out of control, then the person may lose their life either through misadventure, through suicide, or through health-related conditions brought on by not looking after themselves. And so their life expectancy can be considerably shorter. Any comments or observations on that? I imagine you've seen some people in different stages, or even progress through stages in your own experiences. So
yeah, we get many participants like that who just come into even worse phases, especially due to COVID. So that's a big thing that's happened lately.
yes, you've
A lot
noticed
of
change.
them with mental health have just had worst outcomes, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. So you've noticed a lot more stress, a lot more disconnection as a result of COVID.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's that's really thrown a spanner in the works. Certainly, mental health services are talking about the number of young people who are contacting their service in relation to COVID and its impact. So, and people whose jobs are affected, their lifestyles affected, their families affected, their ability to get out is affected. So there's a lot of ways that that's impacted. There's essentially there's two types of mental illness. There's psychotic and non-psychotic. So any stabs or any knowledge about what the difference between a psychotic and a non-psychotic illness is? So psych meaning brain, psychology is the mind. Sorry, sound like one of my students who told me the brain and the psychology, study the mind and study the brain are the same thing. They're not. The brain has got way more functions than mind. The mind is a particular part of the brain. But the study of the mind is psychology. Sociology is the study of society. Psychology, so the study of the mind. Psychotic is the mind is affected. Okay, so psychotic illnesses are illnesses where the mind perception is distorted. So it could be schizophrenia. It could be anything with hallucinations. Anything where thought patterns are disturbed. Sensory patterns might be disturbed. But that's psychosis. That's a psychotic experience. Whereas a non-psychotic is a type of mental illness where the mind is not disturbed, but the behaviour is of concern. Obsessive compulsive disorder is generally put into non-psychotic. There may be some psychosis attached to it, but obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, unipolar depression, which isn't bipolar depression, could be considered non-psychotic, but some of them have a little bit of crossover. Dementia is psychotic because it's a change in perception. People are thinking that they're a child again, for instance. Their experiences are their childhood experiences, so their mind is distorted. Paranoia is definitely a psychotic one. Some of the fetishes, oppositional defiance disorder, borderline personality disorder, all of those are not necessarily psychotic, but anything where there is a distorted pattern of thoughts or sensory is psychotic. Causes, biological. Biological doesn't explain everything, but it certainly explains some mental illness. There's been lots of studies done on biology and mental illness and whether schizophrenia is biological. What we do know is that there are genetic vulnerabilities and that people may have schizophrenia is a recessive gene, for instance, which doesn't always show up and needs to be triggered by events. And they've done studies on twins and all sorts of different studies to try and look at this, and twins that were raised in different countries and had different outcomes. So biology can play a part, but there is evidence to suggest that biology also mirrors what happens to us outside. So there's a concept called homeostasis or homeostasis, and equilibrium. Our body wants to be in equilibrium or homeostasis with its external world. Things look to be in balance, so your body responds to the world around it. So if you're living in constant stress, then your body is going to react and is going to be living. It's going to adjust to that stress. If you're living away from stress, then your body is going to eventually adjust to that. I mean, not to trivialize this, but I've seen horses come from stables where they've been abused and particularly bad behaviour and traumatized, and within a couple of days of being in a good stable and being treated well, their behaviour dramatically changes. So there's certainly evidence within the animal kingdom of change in behaviour as a result, biological changes as a result of environmental changes. So biological, it's there, but it may be brought on by the environment and the social. There is some evidence that if we have experienced death or grief and loss, that our neurotransmitters, our dopamine levels will go down, so our serotonin, our happiness, will decrease, and sometimes doctors put people who have suffered significant grief and loss and trauma onto antidepressants to replace the biochemical transmitters that they don't have or are not functioning as well as they were, and that can be short-term or long-term. But there's certainly evidence to suggest that the events have triggered that change in our biochemical balance. The people we hang around with, the circumstances of family, the school we went to, how we're treated at school, all those things can impact on our mental wellness. Obviously, there's lots of experience and data around school bullying now and its impact on people and suicide. What sort of supports we feel we have from our family, how our family treats us, how our peers treat us, what exposure we have to different types of people. Family relationships and trauma can impact us. We've got drug effects. So people may have a psychosis as a result of drug use, and they may have a flashback to when they used a drug previously. So they might have had a trip several years ago on a hallucinogen, and then then out of nowhere they're triggered and they have a flashback to relive the experience they had when they were tripping. Long-term drug effects can lead to psychosis. So that might be schizophrenia or paranoid delusions, and that might come from continued substance abuse. There is some evidence that cannabis for some people can lead to schizophrenic behaviours and illness, and there's certainly some evidence that modern day marijuana has often had the THC content taken. The antipsychotic protective factors, particularly in synthetic marijuana, have been taken out. So that's a factor in itself. And then you've got psychological, so you've got self-esteem, coping skills, social skills. So how the person bounces back, how resilient they are, how they perceive themselves, how well adjusted they are in terms of contact with people and inclusion, whether they feel that they have a place and they have a right to be heard, etc. We know from substantial research that Bowlby and Ainsworth work, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby were researchers in the 50s who looked into bonding and attachment at a time when mothers and their newborns were separated and in different wards and were kept in hospital for much longer than they are now. And we didn't think that children needed to bond and attach, and mothers didn't need to attach, or the other way around. I always get those two in the wrong order. But basically we know now that the more that people, more the bonding and attachment happens, and the more that we work through separation anxiety with a caregiver. It doesn't have to be the parent, but the significant caregiver, where that is managed and managed well, the young person, the child develops a healthy separation and a healthy resilience. So they become well-adjusted adults and adolescents. Certainly the number of prisoners I've worked with and state wards I worked with in child protection, there's certainly clearly evidence of separation anxiety and neglect at that time affecting their long-term outcomes. What Bowlby found, and Michael Rudder, who followed on and did work on resilience in more recent years, what they found is they worked with adolescent in Borstal in England, which is essentially the same as Keelong or Carryong or Cobham here, Juvenile Detention Centre. And what they found was the young people who had resilience and bounced back and didn't reoffend had a stronger separation. They had a healthier separation attachment. They had a significant belief in themselves to bounce back, whereas children who hadn't had that were at more risk of reoffending and staying in the system. So we know that our coping skills, our resilience, which comes from healthy parenting in infancy, is very important. Okay. So what do you understand to be the treatment options for a person with a mental illness? What could you offer? It's not that funny.
Sorry, that was my kids.
Great fun.
Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, it's providing them with advice on where they could go, listening into, again, what they're, how they feel and all that sort of stuff, and basically determining how their mental, where certain triggers might come from, that sort of thing. Just basically engaging with them in meaningful conversations.
Yep. Yeah, so I mean, there are community treatment options and there are institutionalised treatment options. Institutionalised treatment options really aren't an option for most people. There are things called community treatment orders, and people may be scheduled into a facility from time to time. There was a time in this country, and in all countries pretty much, where family members could schedule loved ones, in inverted commas, and have them locked up in a psychiatric institution. Police could do it, doctors could do it, doctors can still do it. But they're the only people who can do it now. So they have to, it has to be reasonable, what's the word I'm looking for? There has to be a reasonable suspicion, I guess, that the person is likely to harm themselves or harm somebody else for scheduling to occur, and that has to be relatively immediate. Now, there are some horrendous cases of where people haven't been given, haven't been scheduled, and then taken their life or taken other people's lives, because we've erred on the side of caution these days in terms of scheduling, or the system just doesn't always work as well as it should. But most treatment options are going to be either phone support, physical support. A friend of mine's just recently finished working for a psychiatric mental health outreach service where They had clients who had significant issues, and they would check in on them and do home visits, etc. So you may be connected to a service through a hospital or mental health crisis clinic that your clients could receive visits from. They could ring Headspace, Black Dog Institute, Beyond Blue is the one I was trying to think of, Lifeline. So those sort of ongoing telephone services, but then there's also Headspace has a number of clinics where you have psychiatrists and psychologists and counsellors at the ready for people to visit, mental health crisis units. So there's a lot of community options now and less psychiatric institution options, except when people need to be scheduled for safety reasons. There's a whole range of risk factors for suicide. There may be a history of substance abuse. There may be physical disability or illness. And that, the person may find that very difficult to live with, and particularly if they've been physically able and they're no longer physically able. Losing a friend or family member to suicide. So losing a close loved one previously. Ongoing exposure, bullying behaviour, as I mentioned, and particularly in schools and workplaces where people feel that there's no way out and they're being bullied. There may be a history of a mental health condition, or mental illness would be a better way to put that, I think. Death of a recent family member or a close friend, not just a suicide, but any sort of recent death, where they feel that they no longer have, that person's no longer in their life. Relationship breakup, problems, access to harmful means. So one of the reasons that more men take their lives than women is that they tend to use more violent means such as guns and rope. And if they have that available, they may use it and then regret it. There's a really good series called You Can't Ask That. I don't know whether anybody's come across on the ABC. You can certainly look it up. You Can't Ask That. If you look it up and if you typed in suicide, there's a half an hour episode of people talking about their suicidal experiences when they tried to commit suicide. There's one guy in particular who really tugs at my heartstrings, but he talks about he changed his mind, but as he was changing his mind, the chair slipped and the rope, the chair went from underneath him. He didn't die, but he had some significant physical damage as a result of what happened. And so there is that sort of context where people have had previous suicide attempts, and they've had access to harmful means. So he had the rope under his bed for some time before he attempted suicide. And other people may have guns at their exposure. And one of the other guys who is in that documentary, Social Chat, talks about how his friends made sure they took all the guns off him so he doesn't have access to guns anymore, because he tried to kill himself with a gun. So there's a number of factors. Some of you may have seen Looking for Ali Brandy, and I think there's a really good example in there of somebody committing suicide who doesn't seem to have any mental health issues. His father's a Premier of New South Wales. There's certainly a lot of social pressure on him to be something that he's not, both in terms of sporting achievements and perhaps in I think it also goes through sexuality. I think that's underpinned in the backstory of that book and that movie. But you wouldn't necessarily consider him to have a mental health or mental illness, and yet he takes his life. So we don't always, even though of somebody who is suicidal or commits suicide isn't necessarily in a good place, it may not be absolutely evident that they're not in a good place.
So I think in that novel, sorry, just from my recollection, I remember with that novel they were actually, I think the guy was under a lot of family pressure, like
He
parental
wasn't a lot of
pressure
family, yeah.
to
His father was the
succeed,
premier of sorry, go on.
expectations. Sorry.
His father was premier of New South Wales or something. He was in a private school. I didn't read the book, but I watched the movie. And in the movie, what's made out to be evident is that he goes to a rugby game and he's clearly not engaged in the rugby side of that school. He's not involved in the sports side of it. He's very close friends with Josie Alibrandi, but not in a romantic way, although she would seem to have designs that he doesn't have. There's a couple of scenes where I think in the movie gives you an indication that there's certainly family pressure, but there may also be a sexuality issue in terms of identity and not being accepted by his family if he were to come out, for instance. There's certainly a lot of evidence in relation to suicide, and identity and suicide are very closely linked. Whether that's about your work identity, whether that's about your sexual identity, whether that's about your family identity or your role in a relationship, all of those sorts of identities can have a significant impact in relation to suicide. And I think it's something that it certainly was downplayed up until recent years, but there are a number of different factors that come into play, and not even sexuality, but concern that you might be different, and particularly if you're in a very macho environment, which the private school and the football analogy in that movie, I'm not sure how it's portrayed in the book, but I imagine it's similar. So yeah, just raising that as a key issue for people. But yeah, suicide is something. I ran this workshop last year for another group of workers similar to yourselves, and they'd actually had a suicide in their workplace. So we had a fair bit of debriefing around that, and there wasn't much anybody could have done to prevent it. There was one guy who felt that the person was after a hug just before they did it, and he wasn't sure what to do, and he felt a bit. He certainly didn't blame himself, but he certainly felt that he could have offered more support. But no matter how much support you give to some people, that they will still, if they are determined to do what they are planning to do, it may be very difficult to stop them. But we certainly should do whatever we can to try and stop them. Any other comments or thoughts on that? So there's some warning signs around suicidal behaviour. People may make threats or comments about killing themselves. Depending on who you work with, you may have people who make threats and comments about killing themselves more often than they plan to do, and they may never seek to follow through on those threats or comments. It depends sometimes on the context of how they're used. It can be a manipulative technique as well, but you need to take them seriously and to work through them. Social withdrawal from friends, family, and community. Person starts to withdraw. They may start giving away prized possessions. They may start giving you things that they have never let anybody else have access to, and you think this is a bit strange, a bit different. But they may start to not go out. They may start to pull back, or they may go on almost like a party sort of. Once they've made a decision, they sometimes become quite euphoric and start to interact differently. Dramatic mood swings. They may go from being very depressed to very happy fairly quickly. They may talk, write, or think about death. They may be writing poems or stories about death. They may be obsessed with death. They may talk about it more than they normally would, or more than you would think would be generally acceptable. They might get into reckless behaviour, and there's certainly evidence of people in single car accidents, particularly near home, being suicidal behaviour, and we now recognise that and include it in our statistics. We didn't used to do that. Aggressive behaviour, so they looking to get into trouble, if you like, and they may increase their drug and alcohol usage. So the next thing to talk about after that really is stigma. And stigma in terms of mental illness is the thing that most significantly affects people. It affects people's perception, it affects people's health. People feel they have a label on their head. They feel that they are treated differently. What do you think stigma is?
I perceive stigma as like the perceived idea about something. So, for example, if we're talking about stigma associated with mental health, specifically with males, how there's I believe there's a higher rate of suicide with males, but a lower rate of depression, and that's purely for the fact that men, just because of the stigma associated with mental health and especially toxic masculinity, they don't get diagnosed and they don't seek help. And I think that's largely got to do with the bad stigma associated with men not being able to express their feelings, and also not just that, but also the stigma associated with mental health, which you've already stated before about the labeling and there's something wrong with them and that type of stuff.
So you mentioned toxic masculinity. I often refer to that as hegemonic masculinity, where you've got this sort of concentric circle of what it means to be a man, and anything outside of that is not a macho male, and that creates all sorts of dramas. But in that toxic masculinity or hegemonic masculinity, there is a point where men don't ask for help, they don't express feelings, they shouldn't cry. They should be able to cope with everything thrown at them. They have to be on top of everything. Now, some of that's stereotype, and some of that is, I think that leads to stigma. Stigma and stereotypes are very closely intertwined or engaged. In fact, when I studied this at uni, when I first studied this at uni, I used to struggle with the difference between stigma and stereotype. I guess stereotype is the belief and the action. Stigma is the mark. Literally, stigma in Greek literally means a mark, a visible mark. So stigma is the thing you can see. The stereotype is the belief, and the stigma is the action, if you like. So the stigma around not receiving help, as you rightly point out, is going to lead to more suicide. So yes, men have more. When men commit to suicide, they tend to use more violent means, and they tend not to seek help. They tend to have made a decision, which goes with that toxic masculinity about, well, I'm going to do something definite because that's what men do, if you like. But that then affects their ability to access services, and as you say, that's the stigma stops people from seeking help, from reaching out, from communicating, from speaking up, and so stigma certainly affects what we do. Any other comments or thoughts on stigma and stereotyping, but stigma in particular? So we need to think about encouraging people to seek support, break stigmas, break stereotypes down. So break down the stigma that men don't seek support, men don't seek help, that women are emotional, etc., etc. Challenge all of that. Speak up if you hear misconceptions being said. about mental illness. Use respectful language and avoid labels like crazy or unstable. So make sure that the language is inclusive, it's appropriate, it's based in science, not in common everyday perception. So words like crazy should never be used. Don't be afraid to reach out if you think someone is struggling. So be there for people and give them the support they need, and encourage them to take that support, and take away the stigma of receiving support, and see the whole person. A person's mental health condition does not define who they are. So it's a part of them, but it's not all of them, and it's something we have to work with. But it's also something we shouldn't be debilitated or stopped by. Myths of mental illness include, if a parent has schizophrenia, you'll have it too. Genes are found to play a role in schizophrenia. As I said before, parents have the condition, you have a 10% chance of developing it. It's a recessive gene, so it comes out in some people, not others. But stress, trauma, and environmental factors can also influence the likelihood of developing the illness. And because a parent has schizophrenia doesn't mean that you will. Autistic people don't make eye contact. This is something you guys probably got your heads around. Every autistic person is different. Some individuals have no problem with eye contact. Others can find an incredibly stressful, highly sensory experience, which means they'll often avoid it. It's not a measure of comprehension of what's being said, and eye contact is not something you have to communicate. And then eating disorders only happen to young middle-class females. They can affect anyone, male or female, young or old, across all cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds. Women going through adolescence and adulthood have a higher risk of developing an eating disorder, but they're not the only high-risk groups. So there are certainly groups of young women who are significantly affected by eating disorders, but lots of people are affected by eating disorders. It's definitely not a middle-class young female condition. It might be that more middle-class young females seek help, or their parents seek help on their behalf, and they come up in the statistics more. But I can assure you that my cousin in Housing Commission in Berkeley, it wasn't from any sort of middle-class socioeconomic background, and she certainly had anorexia, and significantly impacted her life. So there are definitely people who are not in the middle-class category who have an eating disorder. Any others that you would challenge and say that there are some myths around mental illness, particularly about stereotypes?
That spirits have a lot to do with mental illnesses. Bad spirits.
Yep.
It can be seen like that in several different cultures.
Well, and if I was running this workshop, as I have done with Aboriginal workers, Aboriginal health workers, there is certainly some significant cultural difference in terms of having visits from ancestral spirits. And in some cultures that would be seen as mental illness, and in other cultures that would be seen as an appropriate message for you to do something that you haven't done. So spirits sometimes visit to tell you to right a wrong, to fix something up.
So they call it possessions in some cultures, like possessed by demons, right. Unfortunately.
That's right. So, and then as I said last week, whether you see the Madonna or the devil can impact on whether people see you as having a mental illness or being a saint. There's certainly evidence throughout the centuries of one being treated differently to the other. So if it's a religious visitation, that's sometimes seen in some cultures as different, whereas other cultures would see that as hallucination. So some of that gets a bit tricky, but yeah, you're right. It depends on the culture, depends on the perception. Anything else?
There's a myth that vaccinating your children will cause autism.
Yes, very good. It's absolute myth is the vaccination leads to autism. There was one study with with a random result that has been disproven many, many times, but it sort of still lingers around and impacts. It's impacting on COVID, for instance, and influenza vaccinations as well. So, yeah, good point. All right, we know that about 1 million people live with depression in Australia. I think there's certainly evidence of more depression in the world, but in Australia than there was, say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. There's more pressure on people. There's more challenges for people in some ways. We certainly have a whole range of ways of being connected. There's certainly evidence of depression around social media. And there's a study recently done. I was listening to a study this week on the radio of young people and social media. In fact, if you watch, it's called The Social Network on Netflix. That's where this study came out of, actually, where young people are suffering from depression and anxiety as a result of their social media and lack of inclusion. At a personal level, I know that people were posting they were going out on Saturday nights, and at that time I wasn't going out on Saturday nights, and I used to think, oh, you're going out and I'm not, and it can lead to an identity of I'm not as well liked as other people. For instance, I dealt with that fairly quickly and realised I didn't want to go out on Saturday nights anymore anyway, except on occasions when I do want to, but yeah, it certainly highlighted to me how quickly people can be affected by social media and by modern living in terms of what's expected, and also in terms of status around jobs and perceptions of jobs, etc. A lot of people have anxiety. 2 million people, so that's that's what one in 5, 1 in 4 have anxiety. We all have mild anxiety about some things, generally speaking. Phobia is where it stops you absolutely from doing something. Anxiety is where it makes it difficult for you to do something, and you might resist doing things. I've met a number of people who I knew years ago who now have anxiety disorder and can't go out, can't go to new places, can't meet up because of their anxiety. It might be about not taking on challenges because of anxiety. 1 in 5 men and 1 in 8 men are likely to experience depression in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men are likely to experience anxiety. And 6 Australians die by suicide every day, 5 of whom are men. So that's a significant stat right there. When we start talking about work-related mental health, then we can talk about 6% of all serious workers' compensation claims, work-related mental health conditions. 7,140 were compensated for work-related mental health conditions. 92% of serious work-related mental health conditions claims are attributed to work-related mental stress. There's more women than men, but it's a significant margin, 58 to 42. Occupations most at risk: defence forces, firefighters, police. So frontline jobs where people are experiencing trauma firsthand. School teachers 8%. Health and welfare support workers 6%. I had a friend when I lived in Goulburn who went into to a rehab centre for psychiatric illness for a breakdown. It was a private facility, and everybody in there was either a school teacher, a doctor, or a vet. Doctors and vets have very high levels of breakdown as well. Apparently, vets have the highest level of suicide of any profession. I'm not sure what that's about, apart from the stresses of the work, and maybe a feeling that they have to be on top of their game. Types of mental health conditions for which workers received compensation. So stress, anxiety stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and depression. So the 37% reacting to stresses would be the nature of the job, I would think, and also bullying would go into that category. And the main causes of serious mental health conditions are 10% violence, 20% harassment or bullying, and 21% work pressure. So, time to talk about recovery in terms of mental health. And it's about getting better. Recovery is about getting well and staying well. And we can talk about primary healthcare. Primary healthcare is about prevention. It's about making sure that people have adequate resources, adequate information, that there are services that people are cared for before the event, not after the event. Secondary, tertiary, and specialised healthcare is after the event. So when somebody has a mental illness or is in need of improved mental health, then secondary, tertiary, and specialised healthcare is there for them. Primary healthcare is about prevention. Secondary, tertiary, and specialised is about cure, essentially. There's the government sector in terms of mental health, housing, education, employment, welfare. And then there's the capacity for wellbeing, community connection, community resources, people being connected, early intervention, etc. Recovery is not a cure. Recovery is a state, and people may go back into an acute state. They may go back into having a mental illness. So recovery can come and go. We want to prevent harm where possible, and we want to intervene early. Yeah, I want to go again back to this concept of mental health issues. When somebody's mentally unwell, they are distressed, they've got poor coping skills, they can feel hopeless, they may feel disconnected, they have angry outbursts, they may have too much sleep or too little sleep. Both of those are things to be concerned about. They may be excessively anxious. We all get, as I said, we all get anxious, but excessive anxiousness leads, or anxiety leads to, well, it's debilitating. It stops people from doing things. And excessive worry. So people with a mental illness may be very worried about the future. They may be very worried about things they have no control over. There's a concept in sociology called agency, about how much agency the person feels they have over their life, how much they are in charge and in control. And in psychology, we talk about internal locus of control and external locus of control. When somebody, generally speaking, when somebody is mentally unwell, they feel that their external locus of control is in charge. They don't have any control over their situation. It's all happening to them. It's not happen. They're not in control of it. It's not happening by them, but to them. And an example I would give you of that is a student I had in Canberra. We were talking about going to Mardi Gras one year, and they said, aren't you worried about being shot by a serial killer? Like a street massacre? And I said, no, not particularly. I mean, there've been a couple of street massacres, but there hadn't been that many. Certainly, this is before more recent terrorist attacks, but they weren't going out because they felt that they were at risk of being killed by somebody randomly in what would be a very random event. So they didn't feel they were in control, that control was coming from somewhere else. And that for me was a big insight into how people, this person was bipolar and was depressed at the time. So it gave me an insight at that point as to how much control people feel that they have. And I've had other experiences of that since, but that was one of my first experiences of that. They may have a pervasive sadness and overwhelming sadness that nothing's going to change, and they may be withdrawn. Where somebody's mentally healthy, as I talked about before, they bounce back, they're resilient, they feel that they can stay on top of things. They have strong coping skills, they're resourceful, their relationships are positive, they see the positive in a relationship. Their mood fluctuations are standard. They might feel happy about something or sad about something, but they're within boundaries. Their sleep patterns are pretty usual. They may lack a bit of sleep from time to time, but they get back on top of it pretty quickly. Sleeping and eating certainly affect your mental wellness. Energised, they're able to manage challenges. They like challenges, they take them on, and they're socially engaged. A recovery plan is a collaborative process where you work with the person to achieve their goals, their personal goals that are going to work for them. And they assist with exploring and agreeing to medication and treatment options for routines and also identifying what a relapse is, what a trigger is. Some of you may have done behaviour management plans, and in fact somebody mentioned that earlier. Very similar in some ways, certainly in terms of triggers and preventing relapse. If you were doing a smoking cessation program with somebody, you'd be talking about relapses and triggers and putting in routines to help them deal with not smoking. Very similar with mental illness in terms of putting in systems, putting in agreements as to what to do and what not to do, agreeing to take medication, agreeing to stay on top of things, etc. Okay, so we go from promotion. Promotion happens all the way through here, but at one end of the spectrum we have prevention, universal, selective. So that's for people who are at risk, and then indicated is for people who are at high risk. So we might put in a whole range of strategies for people from the whole public to people with identified high risk behaviours or who've had exposure to traumatic stress, for instance. Then we've got illness identification, early treatment, standard treatment, self-management, relapse prevention and rehabilitation. That's the treatment and continuing care. So we have treatment here in terms of early treatment and standard treatment, and then continuing care is the person being more in control, more in charge. Here we have prevention, here we have early intervention, and here we have recovery. That's pretty much the spectrum of interventions for people with mental illness. The road to resilience is about having a sense of community, having a sense of purpose, relationships, having strong, healthy relationships, effective parenting, as I talked about before, problem solving, being able to see that there's a solution and being able to draw on other previous problem solving, building in resilience, so building in being able to bounce back, looking after your social emotional health and doing things to protect yourself. We talked last week about mindfulness, meditation, going for a walk, catching up with friends, having dinner, eating well, sleeping, etc. And everybody has different mechanisms by how they recharge their batteries and how they stay well. And social connections, staying connected to people. That, from the Mayo Clinic, is a really good map of what's important in terms of your wellness and also your client's wellness, yeah? Workplace resilience, well, that's a whole other story. It's about you staying on top of your workloads, about you being assertive, you not being overwhelmed and not being given too much to do, not taking full responsibility, but owning what you can own and working with that. Now, the only other thing, any questions?
Yeah, Terry, just wanted to ask, I've got Herc here as well. Unfortunately, he got caught up. He had other meetings, so he couldn't attend it. But the recording, where can he get the recording from?
I will.
Anyone that's missed out, where can they get the recording from?
Okay, so I'm going to put a channel up here called Recorded Sessions. In fact, I'll do that now. And both sessions will be up there as an MP4.
Yeah.
So when you go into recorded sessions in the channels,
yeah,
it'll be up there as files. So I'll do that at the end of the meeting.
Yeah.
I will stop recording now.